Father God, we thank you for your word, and we pray that you would work in our hearts afresh. Once again, Lord, it is so much easier to learn at someone else's expense what not to do than to make the mistakes ourselves. Please open your word to every heart that's here, every heart that's listening. Because we've taken the time, Lord, to sit before your word, may your Holy Spirit allow us to leave here changed. Thank you for loving us, Lord, in spite of ourselves. Thank you for your mercy that's new every morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, let's see. And the Midianites, verse 36, chapter 37, sold Joseph into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. Turn to chapter 39. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, wait a second, what's in between 37 and 39? 38. And look what 38 says. It came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren. Why put it here? I was driving along yesterday. We're making some living changes for my parents, so I was busy with that. And driving along, and I'm basically like, why here? Why is the chapter in the middle of what happened with Joseph? It could have been before this. Could have been at the end of this. Why put it here? And then it began to dawn on me, perhaps it could be from chapter 37, verse 26. Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, nice of them, and our flesh. And his brethren were content. He's the guy that said, let's sell him. Then we get into verse 38, 35. Jacob and all his sons, all his daughters rose up to comfort Jacob. But he refused to be comforted, for he said, I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. And thus his father wept for him. So Judah has basically orchestrated, or he was the brain trust behind selling his brother into slavery. He's now back with the family. Jacob constantly mourning and grieving the loss of this son. And then we find Judah basically going, quote, going down, interesting thought, and hanging out with the Canaanites, the ungodly. We're going to see the impact of that. It's almost like having committed one egregious sin, he's sort of reached the point of like, what's it matter? And you watch his behavior sort of careen off, as we'll see. And that's one of the things Satan likes to do to an individual, get you to sin, get you to do something, and get you to believe that what you've done is so bad that there's no way you could ever go back to church or be around God's people or get right with God. It's hopeless. He loves to lie to people and tell them that. And that's why I'm so grateful, for example, that as we go through the Gospels, we find the thief on the cross. I mean, how do you hide from your reputation there? And yet Jesus said, truly, I tell you, you'll be with me today in paradise. When he said, Lord, remember me, he repented and he asked for forgiveness. At the last moment, being put to death for a capital offense, he came to Christ. I don't suggest you wait for that last moment because there's too many people on their phones driving. You may not get it. But interesting, even at that last chance, the Lord would receive and forgive that thief. So it came to pass, chapter 38, at that time, the time when they sold their brother, that Judah went down from his brethren. Probably not the best environment to be around your father who's grieving, even though you know it's a lie. And he turned into a certain Adullamite. Adullamite, the idea comes from the idea of justice of the people. And there's a cave of Adullam. Who hid in the cave of Adullam? First service, got it, no pressure. David. You got it right if you said David. Cave of Adullam. These are the Adullamites. This area roughly 15 miles, so roughly northwest of Hebron. You'll find it. They came to the Adullamites. A certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Hira means a noble race, or the idea of a noble or distinct individual or nobility. And Judah saw there the daughter of a certain Canaanite, pagan. The Canaanite whose name was Shua. And he took her and he went in unto her. He married her. Wait a second. What was the last descendant of Abraham that started marrying Canaanites? Starts with an E, ends in a Esau. He's going to the ungodly for a wife. That's interesting. So he's hanging out with Hiram of the Adulamites. He's down there. He sees a certain Canaanite. His name is Shua. Finds his daughter, decides she's the one, and he went in unto her. And she conceived and bare a son. And he called his name, what do you want to call him, honey? I love it. Somehow, which means watchful, awake, or waking, must have been an alert little dude. And she conceived again. How many understand time is passing here? Right? Just want to make sure. She conceived again, and she bare a son. Interesting, verse 3, he named the first one. Verse 4, she called his name Onan, which is strong. And yet again she conceived and bare a son, and called his name Shelah, which we think means a petition, or some of the idea of having peace. And he was at Chezib when she bare him. Chezib means deceitful or false. Message? Maybe. Well, what happened? Judah took a wife for his firstborn. How many realize time has passed? Just want to make sure. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar, which means palm tree. We are not told thus far of her lineage. One day when we get to heaven, we'll meet her. We're not sure if it's one of the other daughters of his brothers. We have no idea. Just Tamar. She arrives on the scene. Her name is palm tree, Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was Ra in the Hebrew, evil. Wicked in the sight of the capital Lord. Who's that? Jehovah. And the Lord slew, there's our word muth. And the day you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll surely muth. So the Lord muthed them, slew them. Question. Is this a surprise? Abraham taught Isaac about the true and living God. You can see Abraham giving that faith to his son. And even, quite frankly, with Ishmael, you could see that there was a knowledge of the true and living God. Isaac gave knowledge to Esau and Jacob of the true and living God. So much so that when Jacob was there with Laban and they were kind of making an agreement, he swore by the fear of his father, the walk of his father with God, the idea, the fear of his father, Jehovah, whom he had learned from his father. You see this passing down from father to son, the faith in the true and living God. Now we get to Judah. Judah, the guy who sold his brother into slavery. What do we find? The kid that he raises is evil before the Lord, so bad, so evil, God spanks him and takes him out. When your kids become adults, they are now adults. That's how I got it. Morning. They're adults. And adults have a right to do their own decisions, which can really be a challenge. And they may choose, sadly, not to walk with God. You can't make them, you know what I mean? You can't make them believe. But you want to make sure you've done your best not to give them an excuse not to believe. That they can see in you a genuine faith, because more is caught than taught by kids. Clearly, there was something missing in Judah. And maybe that happened with the selling of Joseph and him basically feeling like, you know what, I'm out of reach. I don't know, we'll find out. But was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord muthed him, slew him. And Judah said to Onan, his second son, go in unto thy brother's wife, and Yobam is the Hebrew. Twice translated, perform the duty of a husband's brother. Once translated, marry, and raise up seed to thy brother. There is in the idea, this is a Levirite marriage, and turn, if you would, to Deuteronomy 25. Let's just go look at it. Later, this shows up in the law. We'll read it, and then we'll explain it. Deuteronomy 25. We'll be in verse 5. If brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, that's our case we're dealing with now, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. 25:5, her husband's brother shall go in unto her. And this is what we call a Levirite marriage, from the word levir, which comes basically from the Latin, the idea of Levirite, or brother-in-law. So a brother-in-law marriage. He shall go into his husband's, he shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife. Apparently it doesn't sound like any ceremony or anything else, just she became his wife. And shall perform the duty of a husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall be or shall succeed in the name of his brother, which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. Now, not necessarily to have the exact same name, but he now inherits in the line of his deceased father. Should that child who died or that husband who died be the firstborn, what would he inherit? The place of the firstborn. Well, what if you don't want to do that? Verse 7, God knew. And if a man like not to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate unto the elders and say, by the way, ladies, can I point out she has rights? And she can go petition the court, basically. Let his brother's wife go to the gate unto the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up unto his brother a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of his city shall call him, so he gets summoned, and shall speak unto him. And if he stand to it and say, I like not to take her, I don't want to marry her, then shall his brother's wife come unto him in the presence of the elders and loose his shoe from off his foot and spit in his face. Tui. And shall answer and say, so shall it be done unto the man that will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him that hath his shoe loosed. Name a book where you see this. Ruth. Remember when Boaz went to the gate and had that other one in place ahead of him to redeem Naomi and Ruth? And he says, I don't want to do it. And what did he give to Boaz? His shoe. No mention of spitting. His shoe. So this idea of raising up in the place of your brother so that the name wouldn't be discontinued, or at least the remembrance of him. Because, remember, Simon, son of Jonah. Who's Simon's father? Jonah. So, in the case of the deceased, you marry his widow, raise up a child, it's put in the name of that deceased brother. The name continues within the lineage. Well, so was wicked, God slew him. Verse 8, Judah said to Onan, go in unto thy brother's wife and marry her, and raise up seed to who? To thy brother. Verse 9, Onan knew that the seed should not be his. So who will this kid inherit in the place of? Who was Firstborn. What does the firstborn get? Double portion. Onan knew that the seed should not be his. And it came to pass when he went in unto his brother's wife, that he spilled it on the ground, lest he should give seed to his brother. Now, we're going to fly this plane at 30,000 feet. Everybody gets it, right? 30 years ago, literally 30 years ago in April, Lori and I were in the city of Kiev in Ukraine. If you remember, in December, Christmas time, the walls came down, the Soviet Union collapsed. Boris Yeltsin, standing on the tank, declared they were now free of these things, and suddenly everything changed. They eventually became the Commonwealth of Independent States. Russia became Russia, etc. And so we were able to go on a team with a team of pastors in April, right after all that collapsed, and go through different places within Russia and Ukraine. And we were in a meeting in Kiev, of all things, with a whole bunch of church leaders who had survived 70 years of communism, atheism. Some of these people had to worship out in the forest to be safe. They were always at risk of being reported to the KGB. These people went through it because they loved Jesus. They finally get basically fresh air, get out from under the oppressive hand. We're in this meeting, and they're asking questions of these pastors, because materials would be hard to get and all that, about Bible issues. And can you believe it, 30 years ago, finally somebody stands up and says, what in the world is going on in Genesis chapter 38 here, verse 8, verse 10, as it goes through these things? What is going on? What do you mean? Well, when he did this in verse 9, the thing which he did displeased, and that's ra'ayin, that's evil in the eyes of the Lord. It was evil. Wherefore the Lord moothed him, slew him also. So like, what does this mean? Birth control, we get... So we had to explain to him. The Bible is actually silent about the issue of birth control. And we cover this in our premarital class. Third session, we go through some of these issues and try to explain them to those nice young couples who are starting to figure out what they want to do. But this isn't about birth control, a form of it. This is, he refuses to give to her a child. Why? Because that child will inherit in his father's place, which would give him a potentially double portion. Now, could he have said, no, I don't want to marry her? How many? You're not sure, are you? We just read it. Could he say no? Yes. What would happen? Right? Shoe and spit. So he wanted to use Tamar for his pleasure, but he refused to give to her an heir. We put it this way in modern vernacular. He wanted his cake and eat it too. And in eating it too, denying her the right as a mother to having children, and in her old age, that is basically her safety net to care for her when she's in need. Let me make it even simpler. He used her. And so, when the Lord saw this, it displeased him, it was evil in his sight, wherefore he slew him also, moothed him. Anybody noticing that here's Judah, who sold his brother, and he's already lost 2 sons? Anybody catch that? Well, now what? Then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, verse 11, remain a widow at thy father's house, till Shelah my son be grown. For he said, the idea privately to himself, lest peradventure he mooth or die also, as his brethren did. He's like, 2 down, I'm not giving her 1 more to go. And so Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. This, by the way, is part of the reason for a dowry. A dowry is, should she return to her father's home, those funds are there to care for her needs. Just pointing that out. So she's now in her father's house as a widow. Verse 12, and in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, never learned her name. It's almost like she's irrelevant. No offense, but in this lineage. She died. And Judah was comforted and went in unto his sheep shearers to Timnath, he and his friend Hira, that is the noble race guy of the Adullamite, which are the people of justice, or justice of the people. Wait a second. His wife died, yes? So now he's a widower. You think that might have reminded him of Tamar, who's a widow waiting for a husband? No. Totally forgot about it. So he went up to his sheep shearers to Timnath, to his friend Hira. And it was told Tamar, saying, behold, thy father-in-law goeth up to Timnath to shear his sheep. This is a time, usually around March, it's a time of festivity because you're reaping. In this case, wool also comes with crops and other things. And when you're reaping, it means we're doing well, and that's a time when people feel kind of excited. And in the pagan cultures, as these things are happening, harvests are coming in, but they also start another planting. Their sheep are, again, producing for them. It is often a time in the pagans for fertility worship, because their fertility worship is the idea to help the earth be more fertile. So it can also be quite a decadent time among the ungodly, or the Canaanites, based on the things we've learned of their history. So he's going to shear his sheep, which is a time people get a little loose, should we say. Knowing that's happening, verse 14, she put her widow's garments off from her, and she covered herself with a veil, so you can't recognize her, and wrapped herself and sat in an open place, which is by the way the Timnath, for she saw that Shelah was grown, which he had been promised as a husband, and she was not given unto him. Judah is holding out, so she's going to solve it. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a harlot, because she had covered her face. And he turned in unto her by the way and said, go to, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee. Oh, well, there you go. So Judah's on his way up, thinks she's a harlot, so decides he'll stop and stay a while. How many realize Judah's not very illustrious? How many? Anybody? Wait a second. This guy, whose tribe is the Messiah descended from? Judah. God can use a goofball like this? Yes. And God can use a goofball like us. Well, must be a harlot. Might as well stick around. At this time of fertility worship, according to Irwin and other historians, there are women who are dedicated to that worship, and the proceeds of that go back to the houses of worship they represent. And often for a harlot at this time, it is argued by Irwin in his commentary that the price or the exchange would be for this a kid of the goats. Let's see what happens. So he didn't know that it was his daughter-in-law. I mean, that would have changed everything, right? Guys, when you log in and look at pornography, you're looking at somebody's daughter, ultimately. Ladies, I gotta say it because it's changing. When you log in and look at pornography, you're looking at somebody's son or daughter. And I can tell you that when that parent held that little child in their arms, the last thing on their mind is someday my kid will be involved in this industry, where essentially Revelation described it as trafficking in the souls of men or women. They belong to somebody. And we shouldn't be making merchandise of them. He didn't know it was her daughter, his daughter-in-law. Like that would have helped. Still somebody's daughter if it wasn't her. And she said to Judah, "What wilt thou give me, that thou mayest come in unto me?" And he said, "I will send thee," interesting in light of the history, "a kid from the flock." You know, funny thing, I don't have any kids of the flock in my pocket, so I'll get you one. And she said, "Well, till that happens, wilt thou give me a pledge till thou send it?" And he said, "Well, what pledge shall I give thee?" I mean, hey, I'm Judah, I'm an honorable guy. I mean, sure, I helped slay the people of Shechem with my brothers, and I did sell my brother into slavery, and I'm talking to you a harlot that we might get, together, but you can trust me. See, here's the problem. When sin gets a hold of you, you don't think clearly in the time of great temptation. All you see is the temptation. We have a lot of kids, and our kids have had friends over the years, and I've made some few observations, and one thing I've learned is and listen, no offense, right? This is just experience, but a child whose mother or father is either a doctor or a nurse is usually not allowed on the trampoline, will not try a dirt bike, can't do some other, go off the diving board if we, at the pool or whatever it may be, because those parents, what's the problem? They know too much. They see the kids with the broken thumbs, they see the kids with the chipped teeth, they see the kids with all the other things that happen from these different behaviors, and so knowing the potential, they basically say, no. Why? Well, they're ultimately trying to keep their kids from harm, see? And there's nothing wrong with that. My kids are in a different spot because I see the other side of something else, unlike doctors and nurses. I see what happens to a man who gets so caught up in pornography that the next thing you know, he's looking for someone else outside of his marriage, gets involved in an affair, it gets discovered, devastates his wife, devastates his children, loses his good name, blows up basically all kinds of things. Sadly, if the marriage fails, ends in divorce, I see the cost, I see the whole thing of where it takes them. And I see the same thing for the woman who gets caught in an affair, who labored to birth those kids, lactated them, took care of them, and not realizing it by these actions basically destroys the home where her children are growing up. I see the other side. I see what happens when you bite on that hook or you take that bait. I see even with children. I see it with high school, with youth and others, decisions they make, kids who get wrapped up in drugs, kids who get wrapped up in alcohol, kids who get stuck in pornography. I see what happens to them, where it takes them, and the damage that's done to them. I know the rest of the story. I will often challenge my guys. I will never share names, but I will say, hey, you see this, know this is what's going to happen. You got buddies doing that, know this is what's going to happen. And with even the passing of time, I've got some kids that have now graduated out from college. I have at least one of my kids who knew someone in college who vaped through high school, vaped in college, and in early 20s has stage 4 lung cancer. I see the other side, or where self-destructive behavior takes you. And I do my best to warn people, this is where it's going to take you. And when they're caught up in it, they do not want to hear it. If you're right now caught up in something, you're not all the way out here, but you're definitely here. Wake up before you shipwreck. Wake up before you just totally blow it and wish you had never gone there. So she says to him, well, so what pledge will you give me? And he said, verse 18, because he's hooked, what pledge do you want? What pledge shall I give you? And she said, I want your signet, which, by the way, is how you identify yourself. Basically, I want your identity, basically your person. I want your bracelets, that's his possessions, and I want your staff. A staff here is the patriarch of the tribe of Judah. If you remember later on, we get into a dispute among the 12 tribes, and whether or not Aaron's in charge on certain things. They gather all 12 staffs, lay them before the Lord. Out comes Aaron's with rods and almonds and buds and all that stuff. His rod, and often they claim these rods would be passed down patriarch to patriarch. I want your person, I want your position, your possessions. And that's what sin does to you. I want it all. I want everything you've got. He gave it to her. Why? Because he can't get away from the temptation. And he came in unto her, verse 18, and she conceived, talk about timing, she conceived by him. And she arose, and she went away, and she laid by her veil from her, and she put on the garments of her widowhood. And Judah sent the kid by the hand of his friend, I have parentheses around that, friend, the Adullamite, who clearly is not a good influence, to receive his pledge from the woman's hand. He wanted his stuff back, but he found her not. And isn't it interesting, once you give these things up, it's almost impossible to get them back. He found her not. So then he, Hira, his friend, asked the men of the place, saying, hey, fellas, anybody know where that harlot went that my buddy Judah went into because he wants his stuff back? Don't you love friends? He asked them, saying, where is the harlot that was openly, the word is anayim, and it's the idea of double spring, seems to be a location, by the way. And they said, there's no harlot in this place. And so Hira returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. And also the men of the place, see, he's been asking, they said, there is no harlot in this place. And Judah said, shh, let her take it to her, lest we, note the we, he, lest we be shamed. Question, what's in your hand? A Bible. What chapter are you in? 38. What are you learning about? Judah's sin. What does he not want to be? Exposed. How many get it? How many haven't gotten it yet? 3,500 years ago, this got recorded by Moses, 1446 BC, and it hit the printing press. It's one of the most widely distributed books in the world, most widely read, and we all know, if you've been through Genesis 38, that no matter how he tried to hide it, we know what happened. That's how I wrote, hey, Judah, read your chapter. Good thing you weren't shamed. Well, behold, I sent this kid, and thou hast not found her. In other words, hey, I was honorable. I kept my part of the bargain. All right. Mm-hmm. Well, it came to pass about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot. In other words, she's pregnant. And also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, bring her forth and let her be burnt. Whoa, the word is seraph, as in seraphim, burning. Let her be burnt. Now, let me ask you, what is the normal penalty for adultery once we get to the law? Death by stoning. And who should be stoned? The man and the woman, which is why in John 8, Jesus dismissed the case. They only brought the woman, and no witnesses would testify. And if you have no witnesses to accuse or testify, it is a mistrial. He was just in dismissing her case. Love it. There's only one account where it talks about a woman to be burned for being or playing a harlot. You will find that in Leviticus 21:9, and there it says, if a daughter of a priest plays the harlot, she has basically dishonored her home. And they would stone them first, then burn them, according to historians. And it's interesting because there it implies that she, growing up in that household, should know better. Here's the thing. She's been playing the harlot. She's been involved in whoredom. Bring her forth and let her be burnt. Wait a second. Who also has been involved in whoredom? Judah. Did you notice all the women said that? Him. The women are like, Dad, why is it my sin looks so much worse on you? Why is it my failure but on you, it's like, oh, I can't believe it. Why is it when we see our same sin, behavior, whatever, on someone else, we're outraged, but then when we look at ourselves, we go, well, everybody's flesh. When she was brought forth, this had to be an interesting meeting, She sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whose these are, am I with child? And she said, discern, that's to know or acknowledge. Discern, I pray thee, whose are these? The signet, again, your person. The bracelets, your possessions. The staff, your position. Tell me, what idiot gave me these? Sorry, it's not in there, but just tell me, what person gave me these things? And Judah, man, she was smooth. She's got them lock, stock, and barrel, man. No further questions, Your Honor. Judah acknowledged them, same word, discerned them. And he said, she hath been more righteous than I. She had a just cause. I deserve a husband. You asked me to wait. You've refused to give him to me. So not only have I not received a husband, I am not receiving the blessing of marriage, should she be able, which she clearly is, to conceive and have children. And those children would hopefully be those who watch out for me in my old age. You have robbed me of these legitimate things. And so she took it into her own hands. She hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not Shelah my son. And Judah knew Tamar again no more. That was their only time. If you go to the genealogy of Matthew, where are all these names in? I'll tell you why. The genealogy of Matthew takes you from the bloodline down to Joseph, his adoptive father. And Judah, Tamar, and Pharez are mentioned. She's in that lineage. If you go to Luke chapter 3, you have the lineage of Mary, his biological mother. He is God in human flesh through the line of Mary. Joseph took responsibility for him, an adoptive father, but is not directly biologically connected to him. It is the product of a virgin who was found with child, and that virgin brought forth a son, and we call his name Emmanuel, God with us. That is through Mary's line. You might say, why does it matter? I'll tell you why it matters. Because when you get to King David, everybody heard of him? David and Bathsheba, heard of them? First son died. Second son was Solomon. Joseph comes from the line of David and Bathsheba producing Solomon. If you've read Jeremiah, you know that that line, as Israel began to the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom corrupted, there was a curse placed against Coniah that none of his descendants would reign on the throne of Israel. Satan thought through their rebellion that he had gotten him into, and that curse that he got placed on him, that made the line of Judah essentially unable to have King Messiah. However, in Mary's account there, it goes from David and Bathsheba, not Solomon, but Solomon's younger brother, Nathan. And it goes all the way down from Nathan down to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so he is of the line of Judah. He is of the tribe of Judah. He's of the line of David. And he comes through David and Bathsheba and Nathan. And he is able to not only be king, but there is no curse on his line to sit on the throne of David. That's why it matters. Go look at the two genealogies. You'll find them and you can trace them. And you'll see where it deviates out and then where it heads down. Just letting you know. Tamar is listed in the genealogy of Matthew. She is listed there. And obviously, interesting, Judah's wife, not mentioned. The one who died, the other kids, not mentioned. So even though this is an odd set of circumstances, God allowed it and God will use it, and Tamar's name is even in the lineage. Wait a minute, you mean that the Son of God would be descended from people who got caught up in this kind of mess? Yes. Why? Because he came to save sinners. There's no one righteous, no, not one. You turn from your sin and you ask for his forgiveness, he'll forgive you. It's by grace you've been saved, through faith. That not of yourselves. It's a gift of God. Not of works, lest any man should boast. You bring your mess to Jesus and ask his forgiveness. He will forgive you and change you. You will go from living in sin to being turned by God and beginning to try to walk with him in righteousness. And yes, you'll make mistakes. But the general tone of your life will be a changed life. Why? Because you met the living God. Well, he knew her not again, no more. Verse 27, it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. And that runs in the family because Rebekah had twins, Jacob and Esau. And it came to pass when she travailed that one put out his hand. So some little guy's arm got shoved out, kind of just, whether against his head or whatever it may be, but a hand got out far enough that the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, this came out first. And it came to pass as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. That had to be interesting to see in the womb. I don't know if the other guy grabbed the umbilical cord, like, oh no, you don't, yanked him back. Think about mud wrestling and amniotic fluid and varnix all over your body. I mean, talk about like just slip sliding away, moving around. And these little dudes were at it, I tried to keep him from going in. He pulled back out. And the other came out, and she said to him, his brother, how hast thou parats, broken forth, or breached? How'd you do that? This breach, parets, be upon thee, and therefore his name is called Parets. You know him as Pharez. And he again is in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zara, which seems to be rising. His name was called Zara. I would call him late. How many of you can see thus far that by their interacting with the Canaanites, it has caused harm to the children of Israel? How many can see the influence? Whether Dinah getting raped, the Shechemites getting wiped out, the idols they had to bury under the oak tree as they were coming forth, and now we got Judah hanging out with the locals, and where does he end up? Well, 2 kids dead because they're evil, because apparently he failed to teach them about the fear of God in some way. Then this whole rigmarole of Tamar's daughter-in-law pretending, thus far, not a good influence. True? Not so good. So now God has to protect them. And the way he's going to protect them is he's going to ultimately bring them down to Egypt. And I'll use a nice word. The Egyptians are biased. You're going to see as we go through this, they do not like interacting. Number 1 with shepherds. They loathe shepherds. 2, these Semitic people, these Hebrews, they view them basically as, they won't even eat with them. They're biased. But God will use that bias to keep his people separate. And he will use it to prepare them. And ultimately, sadly, they will even be enslaved. But he's going to use that time of isolation to do his work in them. And that's often something that happens to us where maybe some things in your life aren't so good right now and you're just steeped in it. And so for God to finish his work in you, sometimes he's got to suddenly they aren't calling you anymore, they unfriend you, whatever they do now, I don't know, I'm out of touch. But suddenly all these people are God just gets them out of your way. They're gone, they're just gone. You're like, what's going on? Well, whatever was going on with these people, clearly not good. And so God in his love for you has basically said, get out of the pool, and he's going to deal with you alone. And you will find that when God does that kind of work in your life, you will grow in your walk with him. Your life will change. You may not like it in the beginning, but you'll look back one day and say, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. So should God be pulling people out of your life, or perhaps blowing things up in your face and now they're burnt, you have no more interaction with it, be it group or events, there's a reason why. He has a plan for you. He is the author and the finisher of our faith. And what do we do the whole time? Oh, God, what are you doing? We cry and complain. Chapter 39. Joseph, remember him? We're out of time. Pick him up next week. Let's stand, let's pray.